So, hi everyone. Good to see y'all tonight. This is session 2 of month 2 of becoming anti-racist. And just as a reminder, this was a webinar series that was designed specifically for the purpose of engaging with white teachers who see themselves as liberal. Well, I'll say ourselves because I'm white myself, but realize that just being liberal, just being kind, just loving my students, just whatever else is not the same as being anti-racist. So the whole idea was that I would use my organization, a white-owned organization, to do the administrative work, but I would gather 4 powerful voices of color, voices of the global majority, and compensate them for sharing their labor, emotional and otherwise, with white educators who are trying to learn better. So that's the whole idea. And this is part 2. And we're now talking about 2 exciting things. One is I will send out tomorrow with the link to this recording. I will send out a date and time where we're going to do a special session with all 4 panelists online together. So that will be Liz Kleinrock, Eddie Moore Jr., Cheryl Matias, and Cornelius Minor all together with me doing a little facilitating. So that'll be, that announcement will be coming tomorrow. And all 4 of the panelists have expressed interest in doing some sort of round 3. We're not sure what that's going to look like, and it's definitely not going to be in September or October. It'll probably be in November, but we'll keep you all posted on that. So tonight we have the return of, should I introduce you as Liz or Elizabeth?
Definitely, Liz.
I
Are
see
you my
Elizabeth.
parents? Only my parents call me Elizabeth.
Oh, okay. Well,
And then
teaching
you need it for like
tolerance.
legal purposes. Yeah.
Okay. Teaching tolerance calls you Elizabeth too. So how dare they? But well, they put Elizabeth at the top, but then in your actual bio they call you Liz. So I'm just going to read a bio. Then I am going to turn off my audio and video, and Liz will do a screen share and take you through a presentation, and then we'll do the regular Q&A. So Liz Kleinrock creates curricular content for K-12 students around issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and specializes in designing engaging and accessible units of study for all ages of learners. She began her career in education as an AmeriCorps volunteer teacher in Oakland, California in 2009, and has since served as both a classroom educator and diversity coordinator in Los Angeles. Liz also works with schools and districts throughout the United States to develop workshops and trainings for adults that support culturally responsive practices that fit the needs of specific communities. In 2018, Liz received the Teaching Tolerance Award for Excellence in Teaching, and she has written for Heinemann Publishing, Teaching Tolerance, ASCD, and EdSurge on topics such as destigmatizing privilege, trauma-informed teaching, and cultivating relationships with students and families. Recently, Liz wrote and delivered a TED Talk, How to Talk to Kids About Taboo Topics. She is working on her first book, which I think is with Heinemann. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay, so that is Liz, and I'm really excited to hear her part 2. And you can check Liz and myself both out at Liberate and Chill, right? So that's another connection there. So thanks for being here, Liz. I'm so excited to hear your part 2, and I am going to turn myself off. Let me make sure you can.
I can screen share.
Okay, actually, okay. All right.
Cool. Okay. Thanks. So first of all, I'm glad so many folks liked the article. The first thing I'm going to do before that is plug this awesome book. I did not write it. It is called Readings for Diversity and Social Justice. If somebody wants to just like type the title in the chat so folks can look it up. Shay Martin recommended it to me, and honestly, it is like one of the best purchases I have made in the past couple of months. It is quite thick, but it is a number of different articles around different topics. It is really an incredible like intersectional text. There are articles around like religious diversity, disability, race, gender, like you name it. And they're all quite short too. So you really don't have to go through every single thing. Like it's very bite-sized. It does not have one particular author. It's a collection of different articles. It's edited by Maurianne Adams, Warren J. Blumenfeld, D. Chase Catalano, Carrie Safri de Jong, Heather Hackman, Larissa Hopkins, Barbara J. Love, Madeline Peters, J.V. Schlasco, and Jimena Zuniga. Highly recommend it. The article that I sent all of you around identity is actually the very first piece in it, and it is by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. I have never seen the third edition. I recommend the one that I have. It's the only one that I've seen. I know that in the past there have been differing opinions about the use of the chat box. Just know that I can't see it when I'm screen sharing. I personally don't mind if people utilize it. I only speak for myself, of course. But I do ask that folks kind of monitor how they're using the chat. Last time we talked a little bit about like virtue signaling, this idea of policing one another in the chat, people trying to like treat it like the woke Olympics, like how can I check this other person to show them that I know more? So just be really mindful about how you're taking up space and like the purpose for you sharing in the chat or responding to others. I do also ask that it's really easy to kind of go down these rabbit holes of responding to something that could be a little bit esoteric, and then the chat kind of devolves into that. Last time there was a kind of like a longer conversation about these like pandemic pods that more affluent parents are trying to start. And while we can certainly talk about that later, try to keep the chat open and yeah, kind of more just general to like what we're going to be talking about. I do recognize also that there are a number of folks in here who participated a couple or in the last session, and then there are also people who are new. So part of what I'm going to share today is like a quick recap of what I talked about last time for folks who were not present, and then build upon that as well. But the focus of today is really going to be around identity and intersectionality, and also what does anti-bias, anti-racism mean beyond a Black-white binary. So what does that mean for your students who do not identify as Black or white? Okay. So before we begin, my name is Liz Kleinrock. My pronouns are she, her. And to begin with the land acknowledgement, last time I shared that this is something that I am working really hard to learn a lot more about. I recognize the importance of it. There is still a lot of education that I am doing, trying to learn from other Indigenous activists and educators to make sure that land acknowledgements are meaningful and not performative, and certainly not just another box to check. So I'm currently sharing this work with you while residing on the traditional unceded lands of the Piscataway and the Pamunkey people. If you are interested in looking up which Indigenous lands you are currently residing on, the website native-land.ca has these really amazing maps that will show you exactly where you are located. Okay. So just some general things about me. I am a Korean-born transracial adoptee. So I am the only person of color in my entire family. You see my parents down below. Again, it's just kind of a plug for me to show cute pictures of my family from when I was little. My family is Jewish. My family is white. I grew up in DC. And it has been really interesting trying to explore my own identity as the only person of color in a white family, but living in a historically Black city and community. I grew up in upper Northwest DC, which is a very white, very affluent area, and attended an independent school here in the District of Columbia. I went to college in St. Louis, so I have spent some time in the Midwest, and then immediately moved to Oakland, California, where I taught first and second grade literacy through an AmeriCorps program before moving to Los Angeles, where I taught 1 year fifth grade in South LA at 122nd Street School, and then became a founding lead teacher at a brand new startup charter in East Hollywood, where I taught first, second, third, and fourth grade. And this coming fall will be teaching sixth grade ELA here in DC. Have gotten questions from folks on social media before about where I'll be teaching. I am not comfortable sharing the name of my school just due to the size of my platform and how it's grown, and also based around other work I've done in the past, have received an amount of hate mail at school. So just trying to keep that a little bit separate. Hopefully y'all understand. I am currently on the Teaching Tolerance Advisory Board. I'm doing some curriculum writing for them. I'm working on a book with Heinemann Publishing about how to assist teachers who are trying to overcome barriers that they perceive that are preventing them from engaging in anti-bias and anti-racist education and teaching with their students. And I have two bunnies that you see right here. The white one's name is Epiphany and the black one's name is Blue. And they're like chilling in the back right now. They're pretty cool. And yeah, so those are just some basic things about me. If you want to get in contact with me, you see my contact info here. I am by far like way more active on Instagram. I do use Twitter sometimes, but I often forget. I do have a Patreon if anybody wants or requires like individualized coaching, recommendations, things like that. And I do have a website that, as my mother will remind me, is always in need of updating. Okay. So last time, I talked a bit about the multifaceted nature of anti-bias and anti-racist education. And there are a lot of different ways to engage in this work. This is a visual that I developed and I'm beginning to use and expand upon, but recognizing that there are multiple ways that anti-bias, anti-racism needs to show up within our schools. First way is thinking really big picture, but thinking about how we can disrupt biased and racist systems that ultimately harm our most marginalized students. An example that I often give is thinking about the way that testing data is often weaponized against Black and Brown students, emerging bilingual students, our students with disabilities, the way that data is used to track students, the way that these things follow our students and ultimately impact the opportunities that they have in their educational careers. On another level, we have the personal interrogation, which I think is ultimately incredibly important, the thing that needs to come first, but is often the piece that folks find the most uncomfortable and are most excited to skip. But it's really hard to think about how you can invite in the identities and experiences and opinions of your students if you are not also doing that self-work at the same time. So understanding who you are as an educator, recognizing all of the intersections of your identities and also your biases and how they might be manifesting towards certain students in your classrooms, as well as their families and caregivers. ABAR work also needs to be focused on your content, your curriculum, and your resources, the part that focuses on what you teach. I know that there's always a lot of conversation around, building a diverse library, and I think that is super important, but also like very low hanging fruit, like so low the fruit's practically on the ground. You Google, diverse kids books. If you look up publishers such as Lee and Low, if somebody wants to drop the Lee and Low link in the chat, that would be awesome. They have an incredible diverse variety of literature out there, and the authors of these books almost always mirror the narratives and stories that they are representing in their pages. But recognizing that it's not just about what you teach, we also have to think about how we're teaching it. So focusing also on culturally responsive pedagogy, thinking about trauma-informed practices. How are you respecting students' identities and cultures? How are you creating different access points for all students to be able to engage and find success in the work that you're doing in your classroom, either virtual or in person? And also thinking about how you as an educator can decenter yourself in the classroom to grant students more autonomy, to empower your students, to make sure that students are really taking charge and making meaning and constructing knowledge for themselves, rather than like the empty vessel metaphor that as a teacher, you're just there to like fill their heads with all of this information and knowledge, which is quite insulting, because you have to recognize that learning can occur and does occur absolutely everywhere. And students are actually the ones who are the experts about themselves and the things that are happening in their own lives. Okay. The last week, our main focus was on nuance. And I talked a bit about how white folks in particular, I think, often feel caught in this push and pull in receiving different messages from different folks. I'm not going to read all of these out loud, but this idea of like centering BIPOC, if you're not familiar with that acronym, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, in anti-bias and anti-racist work, but at the same time, you also can't expect BIPOC folks to do the work for you. That this work should not center white people, but also like white people are also really important to this movement and dismantling white supremacy. And these ideas often are presented at very different, like opposite ends of the spectrum, but they also hold true at the same time. And that can be really, really challenging to try to determine as a white person, when is it more appropriate for me to step up? When is it more appropriate for me to step back? When am I supposed to be creating space for other people? And when am I supposed to be leveraging my own voice and privilege and power, to advocate for, BIPOC students in my community? I think this is really what developing your A-bar lens really means. And it is challenging, and it does take time, and there is so much nuance, because there's just so much diversity in the different types of interactions that we have with one another. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into identity work and thinking about our students. But something that has certainly come up quite a bit in the past couple of weeks, I can't recall if I talked about it in depth the last time with all of you, but this idea that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are certainly not a monolith. And right now there's an enormous amount of information being thrown at white folks about books that you should be reading, and podcasts you should be listening to, and documentaries that you should be watching. And it can be really overwhelming, but it's also very important to recognize that one book is only written by one author, and that means you're only getting one perspective. So I'm going to use Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I know is like at the top of most folks' anti-racist reading lists these days. His book is great. It also reads more as a memoir. It's not like a how-to book. And you also have to recognize that while Kendi has an incredibly powerful voice, and I think his book is really important, because he's also presenting his opinion and his perspective as a Black cis male, that there are other aspects of Black identity and the Black experience, such as that of Black women, Black queer folks, Black trans folks, that are not included in that book. So it's great as a starting point, but please don't let that be the only thing that you read. I know it can also be really confusing when thinking about messages that white folks got over the past couple of weeks and months, like check in on your Black friends. And some Black folks might really appreciate that. And some might say, we're not actually friends. And this seems to be more about like you taking care of your own guilt. I don't want you to check in on me. The more Black, like folks of color who you follow and who you listen to, you absolutely should see and hear conflicting opinions, because we are a very diverse group of people. We are certainly not a monolith. We don't hold the same opinions. And when I shared some of this on social media recently, somebody pushed back and said, well, like white folks aren't a monolith either. And like, yeah, I absolutely know that. All people of color know that, because we have spent our entire lives in school learning about Western history, learning about Western literature, hearing about all the different experiences and lives and opinions of white folks throughout history. Like, we know that white folks are diverse, but because there has not been as strong as emphasis on culturally responsive texts and curriculum, things that we have been exposed to so often in our education, for white folks to learn about people who do not identify as white or come from European backgrounds, I still find that there's a huge amount of disconnect, and that a lot of white folks want to latch on to the opinions or the voices of one particular person of color who happens to match their own opinions, and sometimes, unfortunately, even weaponize those opinions, the things that they read and the things that they're taking in an intellectualized capacity, and using that to police other folks of color. And so to be really, really conscious if you find yourself in that position. Okay. So the reading that I sent all of y'all for this past week focused on identity and thinking about, what is shared and what is assumed. Something that really jumped out at me from this reading, and that I thought a lot about in like the trainings and different community settings I've been in, is that white folks rarely mention their whiteness when introducing themselves or talking about their own identities. And it reminded me very much of this short story, this quote by David Foster Wallace, who I believe gave this as part of like a commencement speech at Kenyon College, but that there are these two young fish swimming along. They happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" And so to think about this story as a metaphor for what we take for granted, what we assume, and what we actually fail to notice every day because we take it for granted so much in our educational spaces, that oftentimes white folks don't name their whiteness because that whiteness is assumed. In almost every training or new community space that I've been in, and folks are going around introducing themselves, all folks who are not white name their ethnicity, name their culture, name their background. The same way that myself as a cisgender person, I don't always name the fact that I am cisgender. It's something that I'm learning to do. It's a privilege that I'm beginning to acknowledge more and more, but it's something that I took for granted. The same thing that if you are in a heteronormative relationship, that's something that you might not share because you take it for granted, because that is seen as the norm in our society. And so thinking about moving into the school year with our students of all backgrounds, how are you creating space, and how are you also modeling for your students all the different aspects of your identities and recognizing how they show up in our schools and classrooms? Okay. So last week, real quick recap, this is how I also introduced myself, taking a look at my own identity map and my own intersections of my identity. I shared with y'all the identity markers that were the most important to me. Noting that these were actually the ones where I held the least amount of privilege, and it made sense that the ones that were less important to me were the ones that I actually don't think about as often. The fact that I don't have a disability, the fact that I am straight-sized. If you're unfamiliar with the term straight-sized, it means that if I can go into any like clothing store like on the next block and I can find something that fits me, that I don't think about being a US citizen, even though that I wasn't born here, that I was naturalized when I was a little kid, that I don't think about the fact that I'm English speaking or that I'm a cisgender woman or that I'm neurotypical, because these are the places where I hold the most privilege. And as you can see in the bottom one with like the red highlights, that these were also the parts of my identity that were the most validated in school, the parts where I held the most privilege, but interestingly, not the parts of who I am that I value the most, that are the most important to me, and the ones that I think about the most on a day-to-day basis. Okay. So what I'm really excited to talk to all of y'all today is thinking about what anti-bias and anti-racism looks like beyond the black-white binary that is so often presented in the United States and also in other places around the world. So this is a student reflection. This was written by one of my fourth graders. We were doing a unit on the social construction of race, and I had a couple of different ways to check in with my students. We did like closing circles with different prompts and sentence stems and journal prompts. And in this case, one of my students who identifies as Southeast Asian wrote this. And if you can't read his handwriting, I've written it below. I kind of wonder why we haven't learned about my race. Is it just like it's not popular? I'm not mad, I'm just curious. And so that is why I wonder. This hit me like a brick to the face when I read this student's journal prompt. There was a student who shared certain aspects of my own identity, and I realized that even though I had been doing this work for a number of years, that I was actually continuing to perpetuate the erasure of my brown students. And this particular year, I had a number of students who identified as Latinx and of East Asian and Southeast Asian descent in my classroom. And they were so adamant about wanting to know, like, if I lived during the times of like racial segregation, like during Jim Crow and the civil rights era, where would I have been? Like, where was my place? I don't see myself anywhere in these books or in this history. And it made me really think about my own intentionality of how I was framing these discussions. and how I was actually excluding my own students in ways that I had been excluded as a child. And it made me really rethink and reframe the way that I was wanting to hold these conversations, and also, honor my students' identities and histories and make sure that all of them felt seen and represented in this work. Okay. So I'm not going to give you like any prescriptive answers or anything like that. I really want to talk to you about some guiding questions that I hope you consider going into the school year. So for your non-Black students of color and your white students, want to think about where and how these students are represented in the curriculum, in text, and in conversations around race, racism, and anti-racism. Every year when I do identity work with my students, when we talk about ethnicity and culture, like every single year I've had a handful of white students come up to me and say, I don't have an ethnicity, I don't have a culture, which has prompted some really interesting discussions about, what ethnicity and culture really mean, but also follow-up conversations with parents and family members and caregivers to let them know that these were the things that their children were sharing within school. When I started really intentionally teaching about and celebrating Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month, which is in May, I always try to teach from an inquiry-based perspective. And the first part is having students generate what they think they know about a particular topic. I had a number of Asian students in my classroom when when we made this particular anchor chart together. And when we started, just by the question, what do we know about Asian history, Asian American history, or Pacific Islander heritage and history? It was like crickets. I think they only came up with the first two, like lots of different foods, and there are different holidays and things like that. It was like pulling teeth, to the point where you see on the right side of that first section, I just asked them to start listing countries that they knew of in Asia, because that was how little they actually claimed to know about Asian history, about Asian American history, they knew nothing about Pacific Islander history. So one of my goals was to really go deep into like the history of like Hawaii and colonization and imperialism and how the islands have been impacted by the United States. We talked about the things that my students were curious about, and they really did see a lot of Asian countries and the Asian continent as a monolith. And so thinking about, if this is what my students are bringing in, if I'm now aware of my students' biases and their misunderstandings, what kinds of information can I also share with them, and start to structure certain types of dialogues and conversations where they're really able to push back against their own biases and construct this new learning and understanding for themselves. Another activity that I've done in the past, like the two images on the right, are things that I do not recommend that you do. But when we are studying Indigenous peoples, I often have my students do things like draw what you think a Native person looks like, what an Indigenous American looks like. And almost every single time my student draws somebody who looks like the cartoon character at the bottom. I took this off of Pinterest. Please don't do this exact activity with your students. But even that activity shows like where my students' biases are around Indigenous peoples. And we also have to talk about where those messages, where these images come from. I think it's also really important to recognize that we are not creating what is known as a tourist curriculum. So looking at the Cinco de Mayo activities that you see here, they're extremely surface level. Like kids are making piñatas and like collage, like sombreros and all these like very stereotypical things. But this idea of tourist curricula, meaning that different cultures are being presented as a novelty. So kids might really latch on to like music or food or different clothing just because it's really different, but we're not creating any opportunities for students to connect to what they're learning about different cultures to anything else that they're experiencing in their own lives or in their communities. Okay. And so I also want to talk to folks and think about white teachers, particularly as being community educators. So thinking about how you're educating yourself, but you're trying to educate your white and your non-Black students of color. How are you also checking your own biases around Indigenous and Latinx and Asian and biracial and multiracial students and families? we know that anti-Blackness and colorism are not unique to the United States, and they're not unique to issues that white people have and perpetuate. But anti-Blackness exists in all cultures and all countries all over the world. And so when you're thinking about anti-bias and anti-racist work with students of color who do not identify as Black, anti-Blackness and colorism are still really important things to incorporate into these conversations. We also have to think about our non-Black students of color social and political histories. I was really, so like coming from teaching in Los Angeles, if I am hearing about a school where predominantly students are either Asian or Black, I know that because of the demographics of Los Angeles, I'm talking about African American students, and I'm often talking about students of East Asian descent, primarily Korean students and Korean American students. I was recently working with a group of teachers in Minnesota, which has a really high population of immigrants and refugees. And they also described their school as predominantly being Asian and Black. But when they say Asian and Black, they actually meant South Asian and Southeast Asian, a lot of students from Hmong, who are Hmong, a lot of students from Vietnam. And when they were talking about their Black students, they were talking about students who are coming from African countries, places like Ghana, places like Somalia. And so when they had these students in the same space and they were listening to Asian students perpetuate anti-Blackness, and also trying to facilitate conversations between their Asian and Black students, it was a very different dynamic than what I was used to having taught in places like Los Angeles. But there's so much information that I think these teachers needed to know, and what I was working with them on is to try to start educating yourself about the history and the reasons why so many South Asian and Southeast Asian families ended up immigrating to the United States, and having to recognize the impact of American colonialism, of Western imperialism on these countries, and thinking about how those experiences have also shaped their families' narratives and have resulted in their students physically being in these schools in Minnesota. Thinking about what anti-Blackness looks like and how it manifests in all of your students' communities, and also how your non-Black students of color are impacted by white supremacy in different ways. Okay, so I'll leave you some of my favorite quotes. We understand that education curriculum are never ever neutral. Like there's nothing neutral, there's nothing apolitical about education. And currently we see that quite a bit these days when we are discussing things like learning pods and schools opening, that everything, things that are not politicized are incredibly politicized, and things that are inherently political are being told that they should not be political. But this work takes an immense amount of patience. It takes an immense amount of courage also, I think, but recognizing that every single day that you are in a classroom environment, every single day that you identify as an educator, that you're making choices either to uphold the status quo, to continue these systems and practices of oppression, or to do something really revolutionary. And right now, I think we don't even know what that looks like. And something that I really appreciate my friends Shay and Lizzie have talked about a lot is this idea of dreaming bigger, dreaming towards liberation. And sometimes that means really having to sit in discomfort and trying to imagine our schools and our environments that are unhindered by systems that often hold so many of our most marginalized students back. And considering that we have never lived in that type of world, we've never lived in that environment before, the unknown can be really scary. But I think something that we have definitely seen in the past couple of months is that there's no going back to normal. And frankly, we can't afford to do that either. I think this is one of my last slides, but also want to emphasize that anti-bias and anti-racist work cannot just take place between 8 and 3 or whatever your school hours are. These are some really, really important texts and resources to me. I was just talking about the podcast Nice White Parents, and if you are white, I highly recommend that you take a listen to it. I think in particular the way that there's an episode around the PTA, and listening to the way that these white parents and folks in the community take up space, I've never heard presented so well as I have in this podcast. I have learned so much about other histories and cultures that I am not a part of through a lot of these texts, but also encourage white folks to do some digging. Like I particularly really like this book, White Trash. And there's another one called White Rage. There's another book called White Kids. If you work in a school as a white educator where your students are also predominantly white identifying. But to recognize that race and racism is something that has been socially created and has also been done to people, including white people. And to recognize that there is still immense power in understanding that history, because you can only begin to dismantle something when you fully understand it. And so that is the end of my slideshow. And yeah, if folks have questions, more than happy to chat more.
Well, are definitely some questions popping up in the Q&A. And as other people are posting some of that stuff, thank you for your presentation. And I think a piece that to me really stands out is the importance of teaching about beyond the binary, but while teaching beyond the binary, also teaching the importance of teaching in the binary. So that doesn't mean we stop teaching about anti-Black racism or talk about, or how important it is to talk about anti-Black racism, even when we are talking about the racisms and oppressions also experienced by other people of color. Is very powerful. So one question I want to ask you just about your own teaching. I think one of the biggest pivots for a lot of white teachers and maybe even white students and white people in general is the pivot from kindness and niceness and to justice and anti-oppression. And I wonder in particular how, because I think especially today, a lot of students, especially white students, what they're used to in these conversations is something about celebrating diversity or emphasis on kindness matters and niceness and that sort of thing, which is an oppressive way to teach about justice. How do you pivot people who want to hold on to that kindness and niceness piece to something more justice oriented,
Yeah,
more
and I think
liberatory?
yeah, and I think especially if you're working with like young kids, there is this really big emphasis on like, just be nice, just be kind. Um, I think those types of mentalities are just kind of like one step away from like color blindness, like we just treat everybody the same, like we don't see color, we don't see difference. And interesting, I facilitated a 3-hour PD today on Zoom. So there's been a lot of Zoom today. But in one of my breakout groups, like I also like to participate as a facilitator. And there was an older white woman in this group, and the rest of the group was actually quite diverse. And she was talking about, just that, like, I see people as they are. Like, I grew up in a time when, people just wanted to be viewed as like the beautiful person that they are. And it feels like when we do activities around like intersectionality, that all we're doing is like putting people back in a box. And that seems like the antithesis of like what we were trying to do before. And so I had this conversation with her, and like I understand, and I understand like your logic in that, but we also have to recognize that racism exists on different levels. It exists on individual levels and systemic levels. And unfortunately, that being nice and being kind doesn't do anything to change racist systems that we're currently living in. If everybody woke up tomorrow and said, like, I'm just going to be a nice person, I'm going to be nice to everyone, it wouldn't do away with systemic inequalities based on race that we see in education, that we see in housing, that we see in the job market. None of that would go away. So when thinking about this idea of wanting to just push kindness and respect, yes, of course, those things are incredibly important, but being kind is also not the same thing as being anti-racist. Being polite is not the same thing as wanting to dismantle white supremacy and systems of inequality that continue to push our Black and brown students further and further to the margins. I understand why it is very tempting to want to gravitate towards that, but also thinking about whose comfort is centered when all we're doing is promoting like kindness and listening and respect. I often think about white folks who just kind of want to put their fingers in their ears and say, like, I'm being nice, like, I'm not part of the problem. But if you're also not actively trying to solve the problem, then all you're doing is upholding it.
I think there's another way too, that this focus on politeness and niceness and kindness can actually be weaponized against people of the global majority for how they're engaging in. It's like
Oh, the gaslighting is real. It's so much. Every day on social media, I got something like, you know, if you said this a little bit nicer, then maybe more people would listen to you. And what I have also been struggling with is folks who say things like, well, like, you need as many people like on your team or like on your side as possible. So like, why would you alienate these white people like when you need them for your cause? And just how frustrating that often feels, that you will only listen to me if I show up in a way that is palatable to you. And I really hate having to center whiteness in these conversations. And unfortunately with, folks who are just starting out on their journey, folks have to be able to connect or like find an access point in a way that's personal to them. And I find that most white women are able to understand. And like, my mother is one of these people. Please don't tell her that I'm talking about her right now. But when I've had conversations with her, like I talked to her about the Women's March a couple of years ago, and kind of vented about like, how performative, like the pink hat piece, and like, it's great to see people on the streets, but like, if change isn't really going to come out of this, then you're just doing it like to be able to Instagram it or put on a Facebook or something. And she gave me some pushback around like, your message and your delivery, and maybe you should rethink like the way that you're saying it, and more people would listen to you. And I told her, like, when women complain about sexism or, harassment or things that they've experienced from men, no woman wants to hear from a man, well, maybe if you were just a little nicer, maybe if you said that a little bit kinder, then more men would listen to you. Like, you really need men on board for like your feminist movement. So maybe if you were just a little like kinder or soft spoken, then maybe people would listen to you. And so she was able to understand that. But yeah, I get a lot of that. It's hard.
Yeah, my general sense is when somebody says something like that, they're not going to be on your. I think most of those people, it doesn't matter how you frame it. I think it's just their way of invalidating it. And I have to say too, the most common defensive response I get from fellow white people, white educators, usually often starts with, I love my students, but, and then after the but is something racist. Mm-hmm. And so something's being mangled there. So there are a couple of questions about this idea of intellectualizing racism and what the impact is on BIPOCs, or what the impact is more generally, and what does it mean to intellectualize racism, and why is that a problem?
Sure. So if you are not familiar with the work of Glenn Singleton and Curtis Linton, I will write in the chat. They have done work around Courageous Conversations, which is a phenomenal text. Hold on, I think I have it up here. It looks like this. Courageous Conversations is a really wonderful tool because they have something in there called the Courageous Conversations Compass. And it talks about the different ways that people engage when they are talking about race and racism. And I'm going to find the visual for you right here in a second when I find it. Okay. All right. So this whole idea shows that folks enter conversations about race from 4 different areas on the compass: from an emotional perspective, an intellectual perspective, a moral perspective, or a relational perspective. And so this idea of engaging in conversations around race from an intellectual perspective, intellectualizing race, means that everything that you are learning about race, everything you know about race, is coming from information that you have consumed, meaning books, podcasts, documentaries, even anecdotes of from other people. But as a white person, because you cannot experience racism, you have no personal connection to it. It's really only about the things that you have consumed that you are able to learn from. So when I use this compass in trainings, and I've also used it like in my own family, because I am a person of color, because I can experience racism and have, when I'm talking to my parents about racism, I'm always coming in from an emotional perspective because it's deeply personal. It's something that's happened to me. It's part of my identity. But my parents, because they're white, are always going to come in pretty much from an intellectualized perspective, because the only things they know are the things that they have intellectually consumed. And I have to tell you, it is really, really hard as a person of color to be talking about, you know, pain and trauma that I've experienced and my emotions and how, you know, I'm processing all of this when the other person is saying things like, well, can you describe like further, like what happened? Like, can you describe more what you meant? Or in more like heightened situations, if I'm having a conversation trying to prove to someone that racism exists and all they're doing is saying things like, well, show me the data. Like, can you show me a percentage? Like when you talk about, you know, I can pull up data and statistics about like Black on Black crime and things like that. But there is just always this distance between yourself and the topic of race and racism when you are coming in from an intellectualized perspective. And also thinking about how data, how numbers and percentages are so often weaponized to prove people's racism, to prove people's points about certain groups of people or certain communities. All of that is being intellectualized. And I think what we're also seeing in recent months, thinking about how the country is now far more aware of racism and anti-racism than they were before. Not everyone, but some folks. The need to constantly consume, and then assume that because I have consumed all of these books or podcasts about race or racism, that I must be an expert at this point. And I can go out into my community and I can school people and I can teach people and I can even check other people of color because I read a book about something that is counter to what they are putting out on social media or what they said in my neighborhood group or in my school professional development session or anything like that. And it's really important for white folks to understand and recognize that no matter how much information you consume about race, it will never mean more. It will never carry more weight than the lived experience of people of color.
Powerfully said. Have you ever been in a situation working in a school, whether you were a teacher in the school or working as a consultant or a workshop facilitator, where you had admin in the school who, school leaders who you came to see as sort of looking at this as kind of checking off the box and not having a serious commitment? And how how have you sort of helped bridge from seeing this A-bar thing as something you pull out of the filing cabinet for a student program once in a while to something that's really informing everything?
Yeah, I think it's really hard if schools do not have systems of accountability put into place. If schools are operating from like a very strict, like top-down um, structure, it can be really, really hard. Like the article that was sent out that I'm happy to share again that I wrote for Teaching Tolerance around our schools really in it for the long haul, starts with an anecdote from a school that I was approached by that I did not end up working with. Again, coming from a place of privilege that I can pick and choose who I take on as a client. But they had a blackface incident. And they were coming from a place of reaction, not being proactive, not really thinking about like the experiences of their kids of color. And they wanted me to, it was also a school like on the other side of the country. So they wanted me to do like a virtual PD and they were going to give me 45 minutes. And that was it. And there was no interest in follow-up or like longer term work or accountability. And it made me so deeply uncomfortable. And unfortunately, we see a lot of that, particularly when schools are saying things like, well, our fiscal year starts here and ends here, so we need to use this money within a certain amount of time. So all of our work has to happen within this time frame. It has been really, really frustrating in trying to explain, actually, that's not how any of this works. And you might actually want to start at a certain place, but after I do a listening session with the folks of the global majority in your community, I might determine actually that you're not actually ready to start at the place you want to be at. You actually have to do all this other work first. And so asking schools, like, first and foremost, like, really, how invested are you? Like, what are your, and I will always volunteer this language, I'll ask schools, what are your long-term objectives? So they have to think about it. They're not able to just say, like, we're just thinking about like a single session, but it's already on the table. And unfortunately, I know, like, right now schools are in a really crappy financial situation with the pandemic, with low enrollment, with kids and families choosing to pull their students out, with the uncertainty of all of this, that there might not be a lot of funds dedicated to, you know, additional professional development. But to also point schools in the directions of PDs, things like the Liberate and Chill Collective, which I think is like quite affordable for schools to take on, that there's a lot of really great stuff out there by folks who have been in this work, such as yourself, who have been doing this for a very, very long time. And often I'll tell them, like, it isn't always a huge financial investment, but it just is an investment of time. So you need to prioritize this work within your community. Often I have also found with school administrators, not being a school administrator, but having interviewed many for the book that I'm writing, is trying to understand their perspective too. And if the work isn't being prioritized, to just ask why it isn't. Thinking about who are the people, or like, what are the systems that your school administrators are being held accountable to as well? Is it because they have to answer to their board? Is it because they have to answer to donors? Do they have to answer to a superintendent? It's really important to understand, like, where your school administrators feel their hands are tied as well. So that way you can work with them. You know, coalition building is so incredibly important, and that does include work for teachers working with their school administrators and school leaders to direct this work.
So there are several people who are asking for sort of micro level things, like, what should I read? What's an activity I should do? And I just want to mention for you all, one of the things we're actually avoiding in this is being prescriptive in that way, and sort of laying out that kind of blueprint, because we want to talk about ideas, and not be prescriptive about practices. And now I'm going to contradict what I just said, because there are also a lot of people who are asking, and I've noticed sort of throughout the July series and this series, people asking, people who are just getting started, you know, and they're trying to find a foothold. And I know it can be a little overwhelming. People are just getting started and they don't know where to start. Do I start with my curriculum? Do I start, you know, how much personal work do I need to do before I start doing something? And I don't want to do damage because I'm not ready and all that. So what are a couple, for people who are just getting started and they're passionate enough that they really, you know, they're willing to invest over the long haul, as you say, what are a few, what's your advice for just getting it rolling,
Well, I think there are always going to be things that teachers can do and educators can do, even if you're not in the classroom. You know, even if the school year is going on, there's work that you can be doing outside of your classroom. Granted, I think it's also really important for self-care and to take breaks, because self-care is an incredibly important part of anti-bias, anti-racist work and liberatory education work. But starting really with that interpersonal work, thinking about the intersections of your own identities. I know that there are books such as like the Me and White Supremacy workbook that are, you know, interactive in a way that allows you to interact with yourself, using like different prompts and things like that. I tend to sometimes, I know, like, roll my eyes a little bit about the number of anti-racist book clubs that are going on, but if you've actually never had like an in-person dialogue with a peer, with a friend, a family member, or colleague about race, you should start. Because I really also don't think that if you're not comfortable talking about race with the people you're closest to, then you're definitely not ready to have those conversations with kids. You should not have those conversations with kids. I would also say that you should get really, really comfortable saying, I don't know, but we can figure it out together, or we can look up an answer together. Because I know that my students in elementary grades have asked really intense, hard-hitting questions that I don't always know the answer to. And I think it's actually a great experience to tell a little kid, I actually have no idea what the answer to your question is, but like we should probably find the answer together. I bet we can figure it out. And so it becomes a joint learning experience. Yes, like Cornelius Miner's book is absolutely amazing. And yeah, Layla's book is incredible. So thinking about that, thinking about if you know your students, if you know the demographics of your school, thinking about how much you know about the social and political history of your students and their backgrounds. As I shared about the school I was working with in Minnesota, that for me, because I had a number of students who identified as Filipino American, part of my own learning over the past like year or two has really been focusing on South Asian and Southeast Asian history and identity, reading folks like Carlos Bulasan to understand like the Filipino American experience and history in the United States. Those are all things that I found to be really important. And granted, yes, it did take time, but I'm super grateful to have being able to invest in that. And I know it ultimately helps me better support my students because I can ask them about their culture. I can ask them about particular types of food, about their holidays. And I have to tell you, like the first time I talked to one of my Filipino students and asked him if his family ate lumpia, he got so excited because he'd never had a teacher ask him that before. I don't think he'd ever had a teacher who could name a single thing on a Filipino, like that was like traditional to Filipino households. And so doing pieces like that, I think can be incredibly important, incredibly powerful. But again, like taking breaks, I think is also really important too.
Well, there's a question here that's kind of interesting, given your own work, schools that some of the schools that you've worked in. It says, in relation to that Bennett quote, do you think that working in a wealthy private school is inherently upholding the status quo and oppression because there is such a divide between the funding of private and public schools?
I think that's such a great question and such an important question. Also, just because I spent the past 7 years working in a public charter school in LA too. The way I view things is my ultimate goal is to get to a place in education where we don't need private schools, where we don't need charter schools. Like they are obsolete because public schools are invested in, are funded, that people in the community support them. And unfortunately, we are really, really far away from that. And I know I've talked about nice white parents quite a bit, but it's also a really great case study about school choice and like magnet programs and gifted programs and how those types of programs within public schools end up like further segregating our communities. And it's really tough because on one hand, I think, there's a lot of nuance. I'm never going to say like a black and white, like it's yes or no. That private schools absolutely protect privilege, protect wealth, cater to more like white affluent families, but also recognizing that white kids being educated about anti-racism is also really, really important, especially thinking about how privilege shows up in their own lives and in their own communities. That white kids absolutely need to talk about whiteness and white supremacy and how those manifest in our lives and how, the assumptions that we make about people outside of our communities, I think is incredibly important. So even if you are working at a private school, like anti-bias, anti-racist work is for everyone, including and not even more so for white affluent people.
My colleague, my Equity Literacy Institute colleague, Katie Swalwell, wrote a book called Educating Activist Allies, and some of her research is about how do you teach kids from privileged backgrounds racial justice and social justice. It's pretty interesting stuff. We have people on who ranging from preschool all the way up into higher ed. And in all those contexts, one thing that I think about a lot is how do we create learning experiences that are meaningful to to students, whether they're second grade students or college students, that are meaningful both to students who understand, who have some starting level of understanding because they are targeted with oppression, and the students who are on the privileged end of that. How do you create one learning environment or one learning experience that doesn't either re-marginalize students who are already marginalized or use them as sort of like props in the gentle diversity learning of white students, or how do you design something that is for everybody? Because I think so often what happens is students of the global majority are used for the learning and the building of social and cultural capital in white students when it comes to conversations about race in school.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of work around identity, like I will drop Sarah Ahmed's book, Being the Change, is a really great text for students of all different backgrounds to engage in. She talks a lot about like the foundations of like anti-bias, anti-racist work in classrooms, and also gives a lot of different activities around building out your students' identities and creating spaces where they feel welcome to share who they are. I think a really big part of this work is also asking students that if they are going to be vulnerable, if you're asking students to be vulnerable with you, that you are also doing the same for them. Like if I have my kids doing an identity map or like a bio bag or something like that, then I'm also participating in those same activities and lessons too. That I can also model as the teacher different parts of my students' identities and the things they share to show a lot of enthusiasm or excitement, or to ask like probing questions of my kids. That's one of my favorite activities. When we do bio bags, my kids, I give them all like a brown paper bag in classroom, and then on the outside they write the things that people might assume about them based on, you know, their appearance or just like how they show up in a certain space. But on the inside of the bag, they can either like choose objects, or they can like write on cards the things that people might not know about them just by looking at them. And to recognize that regardless of our identities, there are assumptions that we make about everyone based on like their own appearance and like some of their more visible identity markers. But there is so much value and there's so much importance of getting to know everybody for like the whole person who they are. And I found that to be particularly, you know, powerful when working with young kids. I think it's also really important to foster like positive identities in your students, especially around race, before you actually start to name racialized identities and talk explicitly about racism or racial oppression. Because if I think a student's first experience talking about racism is specifically targeting like the handful of Black students in the classroom, we have to think about the messages that our Black students are receiving. And then we also have to think about the messages that all of the non-Black students are receiving about Black people and about Black history too. So I think being really mindful of like the foundational ideas that you're starting with and how you build on top of that, like the sequence, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, so most of your teaching has been at the elementary level, right? At
Yeah.
the elementary level, yeah. So I know we have people. I just want to, because there are some people who are asking about higher ed, and I wonder if you had any good experiences as you've never taught in higher ed, right?
No, I've done like guest sessions and teacher ed
Okay.
programs
Oh,
before,
cool.
like
Okay.
yeah.
So maybe something from one of those experiences or from your experience as a student in higher ed where, you know, working with students, working with older students around these things. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think in higher ed, and also thinking about my experience in higher ed, being an undergrad and also being a graduate student, that a lot of my professors I know took a certain amount for granted of us, especially in grad school. So things like if you are talking about office hours with your students, are you actually clarifying like what office hours are? Like, have you actually described to your students like office hours are held on these days at these times, and this is the purpose of having office hours? Like, if you have questions, if there are things you want to talk about, if you want feedback, like this is the opportunity to come to me. Because I've often found that if a professor says something like office hours are Tuesdays, Thursdays from 4 to 5, they might put it out there, but if a student has never had an experience in a school where they understand what office hours are, then they're not going to be able to utilize that as a resource. So being really clear about like supports and systems that are in place, but also that academia is just overwhelmingly white. It's incredibly white. We think about just even like expertise and like the weight that we put on higher degrees, that there are a number of positions out there. I know like especially within schools where like having a master's degree, having a PhD is something that is required, if not demanded, of folks. And to recognize that's incredibly classist and also rooted in white supremacist culture, like the value we place on those. So I think thinking about the value and the weight that we're putting on certain expectations of our students in higher ed is something that I think anybody who works in like a college or university could consider.
One thing I'll throw in there, for one thing that was the biggest shift for me in academia, and I was always teaching social justice related courses, racial justice related courses. The biggest shift was when I realized I need to be teaching at the pace of the students, of the most advanced students in my class around racial justice, and not have students of color sitting through conversations, letting students debate whether white supremacy exists. That really I need to change the whole way that I was pacing. And actually I stopped even pacing for the middle. I started saying, who are the 20% of the most advanced students in my class? And I'm going to start pacing my classes for them. And I found that when I did that, even that everyone made the most movement, because the students who are least far along, they realized, well, I better get my shit together, you know? And I realized I was cheating students of color who are paying tuition just like white students. So why should they have to sit through a class that's really paced for white students? So we're pretty much out of time here. There's so many other really good questions, but I'll save some of those for our group session. Group session sounds like it's not what I mean for it to sound like, but when we're all together. Are there any final points you want to make? This has been really great. You've hit on so much amazing stuff. Any final points for people to take with them?
I guess if you're just new to this, then everybody has to start somewhere. I often like, I'm not super into like the title of expert just because there's always like so much learning and unlearning that's happening all the time. That it's really important for folks to recognize that when people of color are able to share and write about their experiences, like you also don't see like the years of trauma and healing and processing that have to come before that, before we can articulate this in, you know, any way, in an article, in a book, in a podcast, or anything like that. So to recognize like the labor and experience that goes into this work from folks of color, and that it's okay to mess it up. I mean, it isn't, but like you're going to. And if you hold yourself to this expectation of perfectionism, which is also a white supremacist characteristic, then that can be paralyzing. And it's better to just try it and make mistakes and learn from it than take them as teachable moments and then not do anything at all.
Excellent. Thanks, Liz. This was great. And thank you all. Thanks everybody for joining the Zoom this evening. Just a reminder that every Wednesday I send out the video from Tuesday night plus the reading for the next Tuesday. So even though you logged in for this, you want to check that email tomorrow because it's going to have the reading for the following week. So make sure you do that. Thank you all. Sorry we never get to all the questions, but you know we have 60 questions here. I can't get to all of them. So we do the best we can. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Liz. And thanks, Mom. You know, my mom logs into these every
Oh,
week. Yeah.
that's sweet. Hi, Paul's mom.